Okay, good morning. I hope you're all suitably rested after your one day off, and you're back now to face into another few days of stimulating discussions. And by the time you finished on Tuesday, you'll all be totally exhausted, but fully informed about sectarianism. Right, so this morning I'm going to bring the focus away from the Middle East and give you a little bit of geographical and social and religious relief, if not diversity. And I want to talk about sectarianism and Northern Ireland. As I said, I think previously, if you Google sectarianism, what comes up is the Middle East and Northern Ireland. So maybe let's just have a look at the Northern Ireland situation. And again, because I'm an historian, you'll have to forgive the you'll have to forgive the historical contextualization. But nonetheless, I think it is key to getting a sense of why we are where we are. So for those of you who find it a puzzling, if not baffling situation, I mean, it is good and useful and instructive to just review what we're talking about. Northern Ireland is actually quite tiny. It's a part of the United Kingdom. It consists of 6 counties from the original province of Ulster, which consisted of 9. 3 of which have Catholic majorities and remained in what became the Republic of Ireland. So Northern Ireland is actually quite old, notwithstanding its fragility and its inherent dysfunctionality, if you could call it that. It's actually quite a long-lasting state by European standards. It was established in 1921. When Ireland was partitioned into 2 separate jurisdictions, so the south of Ireland, nationalist, Catholic largely, succeeded from the United Kingdom. So a Government of Ireland Act in 1920 established 2 separate states, one on the very north up there on the right-hand side, which had a Protestant British majority, and then the other 26 counties, which became the Irish Free State. Now, this majority in the north of Ireland was a majority descended from settlers in the early modern period, English and Scottish settlers. And they largely embraced, as I've said before, a more left-wing reading of Protestant Reformation Protestantism. They are and were Presbyterians. And in that respect, they mirror more closely in religious terms the situation in Scotland, which was historically Presbyterian. So problematically, however, and they chose to create a state which consisted of 6 counties to ensure a Protestant majority. Had they included the 3 other counties with Catholic majorities, their dominance wouldn't have been so well established. So from the very beginning, it was gerrymandered. So gerrymandering is a process of fixing electoral boundaries to suit whichever particular faction is in control. So gerrymandering. So problematically, however, the new creation contained a sizable minority of Irish Catholics who weren't entirely happy to have been stranded in the new creation. And they could never identify, and it wasn't made possible in many cases for them to identify with the new state, which was predicated on a virulent form of Protestant Britishness. I mean, it was uber-Britishness, it was uber-Protestant, in a way which I suppose was underpinned by an inherent insecurity, actually. Sometimes dominance actually is a reflection, it seems to me, of underlying or aspiring dominance as a reflection of underlying insecurity. So this was like a laboratory for sectarianism. I'm in the wrong direction. So it became effectively a one-party state. And as I said, it was remarkably stable given the authoritarian nature of the creation down to the 1960s. It was presided over by a permanent unionist majority, one government. It had a regional parliament called Stormont, so it was ahead of what was subsequently created in Cardiff and in Edinburgh in the 1990s, where you had the establishment of devolved governments, regional governments within the United Kingdom. So in that sense, it was ahead of the game. But its days began to be numbered most decisively and decidedly from the early 1970s onwards. So just to stress, so for the first 50 years of its existence, this new creation was a fairly stable, from the outside, entity. It had its own parliament, a prime minister, a cabinet modelled on those of Westminster. It had the power to legislate in all areas except foreign affairs, military matters, citizenship, and elements of taxation. During the half-century of Stormont, this local government, London only once withheld royal assent for a piece of legislation, a proposal to remove proportional representation in local elections, which obviously would have copper-fastened, would have made stronger Protestant control of local government. And in that case, temporarily. So Northern Ireland was quite a bizarre place in the context of the United Kingdom. It was really left to its own devices. This suited both the Unionists who controlled the province and the London establishment, who have never been, it seems to me, particularly interested in what happens in the north of Ireland. But Stormont was quite un-British or quite un-Western European in one fundamental way, or post-Second World War, Western European. The Ulster Unionist Party was permanently in power. In effect, the Ulster government was unaccountable and free to discriminate against the Catholic nationalist minority, especially in the area of local government. Now, there is a strong tradition of anti-Catholicism among Protestant churches in the north of Ireland, as would have been the case down to the 1960s and 70s in Scotland. I mean, there's a very virulent, very Calvinist strain of Protestantism, which sees in Rome, sees in Catholicism, the embodiment of the Antichrist. So this is a rhetoric which stems from the 16th century and 17th century sectarian conflicts in Europe. So a substantial minority of Protestants would have viewed Roman Catholicism as a negative force seeking to subvert biblical Christianity. And this extreme take, this extreme evangelical take on biblical Protestantism is exemplified in a very small church called the Free Presbyterian Church. It's got a very tiny membership in the overall scheme of things, but it's significant because it's got an ancillary political party, which is now the dominant Unionist party, the Democratic Unionist Party. So this was founded by a very charismatic figure called Ian Paisley, who may be known to some of you. He founded his own church in 1951, broke away from the established Presbyterian Church. It's a church which has members all over the world, but is specifically in Northern Ireland, Britain, Australia, and I think in some parts of Africa. Its doctrines are fundamentalist Calvinist. So from 2011 to 2015, the church's website described the Catholic Mass as a false notion. Very socially conservative, which puts it at odds with a British identity, which I suppose one could argue was being modernised and liberalised from the swinging 60s. I'm afraid the swinging 60s never quite hit Belfast, but the development of a more inclusive sense of British identity, and in many cases an identity which is predicated less on religious faith but more on civil markers of identity, and the fact that Britain itself was becoming a much more multicultural society from the late 50s, early 60s onwards, with migration from Commonwealth countries. So in a way, what happens in Northern Ireland is that it becomes frozen in a particular mode of Britishness, which now seems quite antique. So a key principle of this church of the Free Presbyterian Church is its hostility to Roman Catholicism. So although smaller numbers, and you may ask why I'm talking about such a small church, which is, I suppose, your classic notion of a sect, S-E-C-T. This is really a sect. They are linked to the much more powerful and much more expansive and much more influential Democratic Unionist Party, which was also founded by Dr. Paisley. So you have in Northern Ireland something which is quite unusual by Western European standards, I think. You have clergymen, members of churches, who are active in politics. I don't know if... I think the only theocracy that I'm aware of in Western Europe is the Vatican, where priests hold political office in the Vatican state. The Democratic Unionist Party was founded and led for 37 years by the self-same Dr. Paisley, and he was both an MP at Westminster and from 1979 a member of the European Parliament. I was going to include a clip, a YouTube clip here from 79 when John Paul II, the Pope, visited the European Parliament, and he stood up and shouted and screamed at him for being the Antichrist, and he was suitably evicted by the Roman Catholic members of the European Parliament. Now, there's a social element to this, there's a class element to this. The first 50 years of Northern Ireland, it was ruled by a group called the Ulster Unionist Party, but they tended to be aristocratic, the upper reaches tended to be aristocratic, middle class, people who spoke with English accents, and they became more and more detached from the reality on the ground, and this Democratic Unionist Party appealed much more widely to a working class base, and it gradually over the 80s and 90s pushed the older, the more established, the more conservative, the more restrained, the more socially elite Ulster Unionist Party pushed it to the margins, and is somewhat irrelevant, I think, today. So it supplanted this traditional and more sedate Ulster Unionist Party. The DUP is both horrific and compelling, and it's become much more known to people in Britain, on the island of Britain, because it held the balance of power at Westminster for the previous government. It's right-wing, rigidly socially conservative, to the extent that abortion and marriage equality were imposed by Westminster late last year in the face of huge opposition from the Democratic Unionist Party. Northern Ireland's a very strange place, a very strange relationship with Westminster. Westminster can impose legislation. It's to some extent unclassifiable. It's both colonial and yet this peculiar outlier of early modern religious conflict, European conflict. It's a hard one to get your head around. They were very anti-European integration, very anti-Brexit. Thus, they were enabling them to support the Tories in their move to a Brexit position. Why are they anti-Brexit? The majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain within the European Union. I mean, there's something irrational here, it seems to me. Is it a subliminal fear of continental Catholicism? Or is it a fear that under no circumstances can one diverge from what appears to be the majority position in the neighbouring island? They would call the neighbouring island the mainland. And again, terminology is so important. Mainland, whose mainland? I mean, for me, the mainland is continental Europe. You know, it's France, Germany, not another island next to our island. So language is so important here. But yet now, it seems to me more than ever, their notion of Britishness seems quite peculiar, okay? As Britishness becomes more problematic, as Britishness clearly is not an expression of being a member of the Church of England, what is Britishness? A vague loyalty to the monarchy? London? I'm not so certain. And for sure, that growing sense of Scottish national identity, or national consciousness, whatever you want to call it, and Wales. Wales, I think, is the first colony, actually. Wales will be interesting yet. What does this mean for the people in the north of Ireland who cleave to a British identity? And more challengingly still, for the first time ever, the 2019 British general election returned an equality of... should I go back? Yeah. So for the first time ever, there were 8 Unionist MPs and 9 Nationalists. So the majority is beginning to slip. Right. So again, though, this is presented as you know, a nationalist Irish nationalist versus British Unionist conflict, religion has been a factor in the historical polarization of the Catholic and Protestant communities. So, most people in the north of Ireland aren't arguing over dogma or theology, with the exception of a small number of left-wing Protestants. Yet religion is key to what is self-evidently a sectarian political conflict. I mean, scholars argue that religion was vital to the generation of and continuity of the conflict. Other analysts would argue that religion is less relevant to the roots of the conflict. So I just want to probe the religious dimension and see where that brings us. There is a very high rate of religious belonging in Northern Ireland. In 1951, 95% of the population belonged to the Catholic Church or a Protestant denomination. That mightn't have looked so peculiar in 1951 in a European context, but by more recently, 2001, a strong 80% of the population claimed a religious affiliation, which does seem extremely high by Western European standards. Likewise, the Catholic population has been growing steadily, and you see that reflected now in the majority of nationalist MPs, from 34% in 1951 to 40%. Why? Well, traditionally Catholics had bigger families. Bright young Protestants have tended to migrate to Britain. They've tended not to go to university locally. They've tended to go to mainland Britain, if you could call it that, to Britain. And they've tended to become integrated into English and to a lesser extent Scottish society. So there's been a hemorrhaging of the Unionist Protestant population. More recently, religious affiliation has become what's somewhat less hegemonic, but still fairly high by international standards. Regular church attendance, defined as weekly, has declined among the three main denominations, the Catholic and the two other Protestant churches, Anglican and Presbyterian. So, even by today's standards, it would appear that the rate of religious belonging is quite high. Most people self-identify as either Catholic or Protestant. You very rarely come across somebody who's neither. I mean, there is a small Jewish population in Belfast. There's a growing, I suppose, Muslim population, but effectively these two categories are set in stone. There is some growth in people who are religiously unaffiliated, if you want to put it that way. So while the numbers of Catholics have grown, there has been a decline in Catholic services. So by 2010, 10% of Catholics never attended services. So again, I mean, there's a freeing up of absolute religious commitment, but this is not especially reflected in the political situation. So a parallel decline in religious conviction among Catholics who simply stop attending Catholic services, while Protestants tend to move away from a formal membership of a church. So how important then is religion as a source of identity? Some theorists might argue that secularization, religion is no longer meaningful, that it's no longer a motivational factor in Western Europe. One would argue, it could be argued, I'm not, but I'm suggesting it could be argued that affluence, materialism, urbanization, widespread education, the rise of science and technology, which in Ireland, like elsewhere now, is almost elevated to the status of a new religion, such as the kind of mad belief in the curative powers of science and technology to solve all ailments. Will this result in the demise of religion? I doubt it somehow. Will religion be relegated to the private sphere? So, like other parts of the world, and we've been talking about them, I think it's somewhat premature to write off religion just yet as a potent political and social power. So by 2007, 65% of Protestants, 74% of Catholic respondents agreed that religion is a source of identity and division. So, as I've said, though, it's simplistic to say that religion per se is the actual cause of conflict. It's a wider basket of factors. It's about identity. It's about a sense of belonging. It's about political affiliation. It's about where you identify with, which culture you identified with. And it's about having power and status, it seems to me, traditionally. Religion, though, does exercise an influence. It's a boundary maintainer, and it maintains boundaries still through separate educational systems and opposition to interfaith marriages. Okay, so people aren't crossing their boundaries. When people are educated and married within a specific belief system, it certainly underpins the system in question. So churches do play a role in the maintenance of communal identities and consequent sectarianism. And again, the same 2007 survey indicated that religion played a part in the formation of views of opposing communities. Only a quarter of Protestants claimed to know a lot about Catholic traditions, while 30% of Catholics maintain the same in respect of Protestants. So that's a fairly high level of ignorance in a very small geographical space. You know, what's going on? These people live on the other side of the road, literally. Why don't they know much about each other? Why aren't they mixing? So if the conflict isn't primarily one about competing in oppositional religious dogmas, religion does remain central to the conflict and maintains a distance between the two communities. So having emphasized that Northern Ireland, by our standards, is still a deeply religious society, I mean, if you go to Northern Ireland, you'll be struck immediately. And it's a bit like America. I'm always struck by how religious America is, you know. By the sheer profusion of Protestant churches of various denominations, and by the fact that you'll see Union flags, Union Jacks, outside many, many Protestant churches. So it's a very visible symbol of religious division. They are very visible symbols. So the religious identity determines, or at least influences, social networks, and it serves to delimit and shape relations between. So if you grow up in a tradition, in a religious tradition, you meet people with the same tradition, your friends are from the same tradition, you go to the same school, there's a self-sustaining dynamic here, kind of almost a spatial dynamic where you become locked within a particular sphere. Even those whose religious affiliation is likely worn, they're still influenced by their background in terms of social interaction and political views. So political alignments more often than not mirror religious affiliation. I mean, one very rarely finds Catholics voting for the DUP and vice versa, Protestants voting for Sinn Féin, for instance. So religion is there, it's embedded within this. One can't single religion out as the cause of conflict, but it permeates the ecology, as it were. So national identity and ethnicity are still systemically and organically linked to sectarianism and religion. So to emphasize, while both cohorts occupy oppositional religious positions, the conflict above all, I would argue, concerns different communal political aspirations. The Protestants see themselves as British, while the Catholics see themselves as Irish. So the Protestants mainly, there are always exceptions, wishing to remain part of the UK, while the Catholics mainly, and there are exceptions, wishing to become part of the Republic. So in Northern Ireland, national identity plays a much greater part in the expression of political preferences than in the rest of the UK. This might be changing, I think, in the case of Scotland. So three divisions basically inform and underpin each other, like a matrix: religious identity, territorial allegiance, and constitutional jurisdictional preferences. Is this ethno-nationalism? Well, arguably it is, and it's supported on an everyday basis by family, education, and social experience. So they're, as Hayes and McAllister have argued, reinforcing identities. They all lock into each other: religion, nation, and politics. And the reinforcing cleavages lead to extremism and conflict. Some data there from work by Hayes and McAllister. I'll give you the reference for this if you do want to follow up. So the relationship between religion and both national and political identities makes Northern Irish conflict quite unusual in international terms. I'm not sure if you'll agree with that, given what we've heard over the past 7 days. There is a tendency in Northern Ireland to think in exceptional terms, and I wonder how, well, exceptional, it certainly is exceptional in the case of Western Europe, but maybe globally not so exceptional. Going the wrong way, huh? Right. So there are according to Hayes and McAllister, there's almost universal resistance from someone from one religion taking on the identity of the opposing religion. So these boundaries are policed quite rigorously. I mean, there's dramatic evidence of the depth of the divisions within Northern Ireland, and implies that the difficulties that any government will encounter. So people don't move fluidly across boundaries. The boundaries are, for a whole variety of reasons, quite forbidding and policed rigorously. Although there are sizable cohorts within each community who are ready to follow a middle path. Next to nobody is willing to move from one side to the other, because it seems to result in social ostracization. Again, I think the key change, lever for change here is Brexit. I mean, Brexit, which appeared to be a straightforward exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, which would, its proponents argued, enable Britain to trade more fluidly, to be more agile, to become the Singapore of Europe. I don't think that's going to happen personally. But that Brexit would enable it to claim back its space as a global player, untrammeled by the bureaucracy of Brussels. So what seemed a fairly straightforward move to put Britain back on a dynamic trajectory. I mean, there seems to be an implication, an admission that Britain isn't on a dynamic trajectory and that it needed to be on one, has upset a very delicate balance in terms of what I would call British identity and the actual infrastructure of the United Kingdom. So, with Brexit, one could argue that notions of British identity are changing very rapidly. Certainly, they've become much more fluid. And from at least the post-World War II period, the predication of British identity in Northern Ireland began to differ from the more fluid and expansive and capacious variety emerging in Britain itself. Changing Irish identity also in the south has resulted, as I showed last week, in a more secular state. So if in Britain itself, if people from the Commonwealth, people who come from India, Pakistan, Caribbean, who began to pour into Britain in the late 50s, early 60s to provide cheap labour, and a British nationality sat easily with these people. I mean, they argued, well, they did come out of a British colonial context. Why then, closer to home, should a British identity be problematic for Irish Catholics who, being part of the United Kingdom since 1800? Why should it be problematic? It's not a question I can answer easily. So along with religion, religion is not the sole sustainer of communal difference. Education has been a key marker and enabler of communal differentiation. So there are two separate systems of education in Northern Ireland since 1921. So the state system is attended by Protestants with a number of voluntary Protestant grammar schools, again Protestants. Catholics have their own schools. They are state-funded, but they are managed by the Catholic Church. There was an initial attempt in 1923. Lord Londonderry's Education Act aimed at one unified system of education, but the legislation was vehemently opposed by Protestant and Catholic churches. The kind of fascinating thing about the North of Ireland is that the number of things they vehemently oppose and that they agree on, and segregated education is one of them. So the government withdrew, backed away, and accepted segregated education, and this is still the situation today. So again, if kids are growing up, going to the same schools with people from the same religious background, again, it strengthens the situation. In that period, students learned about different religions, quite obviously. They read different books, and they studied different versions of history. Catholics, in many cases, would have studied the Irish language. Protestants never did so. Protestants, I find this quite curious, Protestants were more numerous in science subjects than Catholics, especially in biology and mathematics. But I guess this interest in science fits with this notion of a progressive Protestant mentalité, and the opposite notion that Catholics were somehow more mired in the past. Comparative religion was never studied. Catholics studied Irish history with an emphasis on Anglo-Irish conflict. Protestants studied British history, which rarely, if ever, referred to Ireland. So these issues began to be addressed finally from the 1970s onwards, when the level of violence really pushed change, and a common curriculum was introduced in 1990. Right. In more recent years, there's been a progress towards an integrated school system, but on a voluntary basis. It began with a group called the All Children Together Act, and in the face of opposition in the 1980s from both the Protestant and Catholic churches, the first integrated school, which would seem a fairly non-controversial, a fairly neutral move, was set up as late as 1981, initially funded by Joseph Rowntree and the Nuffield Foundation. Since then, there's been an exponential growth, and now there are about 62 integrated schools with just over 20,000 pupils in the academic year to 2014-15. So I think a move to integrated schools was a bottom-up driven process on the part of parents. So again, the state is absent here, the churches are absent. The churches were hostile, in fact. Perhaps by now they're indifferent. And by 2010, 69% of the adult population were supportive of non-denominational schools. But oddly, the political parties lag, and they're less keen on integrated education than actual voters. But I think integrated education has an important role to play in lessening these barriers and diminishing barriers. Anyway, 50 years of unionist rule. It's an oligarchy, I suppose. Came to a crashing end in the 1960s. The impact of the broader world began to be felt. The American civil rights movement clearly served as an exemplar. And in the mid-60s, Catholics began to agitate for full civil rights. A non-violent civil rights movement emerged, clearly based on what was happening earlier on in the southern states and in North America, in the United States. And a variety of groups came together. And they demanded an end, and I haven't talked about it, and Martin asked at one stage, what does sectarianism look like? Well, how does it make itself felt? Well, in the case of Northern Ireland, discrimination against Catholics happened in terms of the allocation of government jobs, as it does elsewhere. There was discrimination in public housing allocation, so whilst new housing was built at a fairly impressive rate, it was largely assigned to Protestants. For instance, in the city of Derry, London Derry, Nissan huts left over from World War II were allocated to Catholics. So Catholics were very clearly and visibly second-class citizens. There was a demand for one man, one vote. So rather bizarrely, the vote in Northern Ireland was based on the amount of property you had, okay? So if you had 2 houses, you had 2 votes. If you had 3 houses, you had 3 votes. 4 houses, and guess who had most houses? Protestants, right? Because Catholics tended to be less well off. So this is quite an unusual situation in the United Kingdom, which meant that wealthy Protestants clearly were very dominant. Only property owners could vote, right? Boundaries were changed to suit unionist needs, gerrymandering. There was a very brutal and sectarian police force called the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It was 90% Protestant. Catholics did join the 10%, never really progressed beyond the level of sergeant. You would never have a Catholic as a superintendent or as a district inspector. There was a standing piece of legislation called the Special Powers Act, which allowed police to search without a warrant, imprison people without a trial, ban assemblies or parades, ban publications, and surprise, surprise, the act was used exclusively against nationalists. So for an internal part of the United Kingdom, this is quite a bizarre situation. So things came to a head in the late 60s. In October 68, the civil rights march was banned in Derry, traditionally a Catholic city. And when it went ahead, they were confronted by the Royal Ulster Constabulary and beaten senseless. This is all caught on TV cameras, and it was flashed around the world. And it kind of acted as a spark, and it and other marches which were faced with violent loyalist reaction. And out of this melee, this melange of things, comes the IRA, Irish Republican Army, and somewhat later a Marxist group called the Irish National Liberation Army, who were particularly fierce and ferocious. And they began an armed conflict with the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Now, it's a fairly low-level war, but given the nature of the population, it's one that's still not insignificant. So from the late 60s to 1998, just over 1,000 British Army personnel were killed. just under 2,000 civilians, 268 Republicans and so on, okay? 8,000 arrested, there was, mass arrests. So it's a fairly, it's a deeply dysfunctional society, and it's one that's completely at odds with what's happening in the South and in the rest of the United Kingdom. With the help of the Clinton administration, finally a thing called the Good Friday Agreement was brokered in 1998 and was signed up to by most of the Northern Ireland's political parties, and an international agreement signed by the UK and Ireland. So what this Good Friday Agreement did, was to achieve a consensus in relation to the status and system of government of Northern Ireland within the UK. So it dealt with Northern Ireland as a component of the United Kingdom. It dealt with this relationship with the South, with Ireland, and the relationship between Ireland, the Republic, and the UK. And it dealt with, it focused on issues relating to sovereignty, civil and cultural rights, decommissioning of weapons, demilitarization, and justice and policing, okay? This was put on an all-island basis. 2 referendums were held, North and South, and there was overall endorsement of the agreement. Now, curiously, the only party not to support it was the Democratic Unionist Party. What did it do in practice? Well, the agreement enshrined civil and human rights, religious liberties, recognition of the Irish language, Ulster Scots, which is a kind of a Scots, it's a dialect in the north of Ireland, which is influenced by Scots, and other ethnic minority languages. Direct rule from London came to an end. Direct rule had been imposed in the early 70s, and an assembly was established with various ancillary councils. By 2000, the IRA had begun to decommission its arms. Further negotiations led to a thing called the St. Andrews Agreement in 2007, where a power sharing, so the two communities the two political sides come together to share power, and here the DUP decided to take part, and it was quite an extraordinary scene to see Paisley, the old bigot, happy to be called a bigot, I suspect, share power with a deputy First Minister, a man called Martin McGuinness, who had been very prominent in the IRA. So that seemed to be the end of history, if I could paraphrase Fukuyama. This seemed to be the end of history in Northern Ireland, but history never ends. James Joyce said history, the history of Ireland is a nightmare from which you never awake. Maybe for all of us, history is the nightmare from which we never awake. It collapsed, this power-sharing agreement, in 2017, and Brexit, as I say, has introduced a new note of uncertainty and tension. As this is actually now out of date. Yesterday and the day before, the UK and the British governments brought the sides together, and they've agreed to reinstate power sharing. I think the Assembly begins its work today, and an Irish language commissioner has been put in place. So I'm not fully au fait with these developments. They're happening as we speak. But is this plaster on a gushing wound? Is this plaster where an artery has been severed? So sectarianism may have abated, maybe less obvious, but I don't think it's gone away. And what's the connection that I've tried to tease out, perhaps not very conclusively, between sectarianism and colonialism? And what about English nationalism? An unexpected guest at the party. Where does that fit into all of this? I mean, English nationalism had been subsumed and written off, become part of the British identity, but arguably it hasn't. It's come back to take on its own dynamic new guise. So rather than bombard you with any more information, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't have a chair, so I'm going to have to ask you to. I'm chairless. Anybody want to ask a question? Or are you also exhausted, you just want to go and have a coffee? Mr. Cooper Davies. Hang on.
This is probably a bad question, but if you play the sort of what-if game, to what extent do you think it would have been different if Ireland hadn't have been partitioned in 1921 for the sort of course of history and development of sectarianism?
Then I think you'd have just had an outright bloodbath. And I think, nobody ever says this, but British Protestants are a very small minority in the overall context of Ireland's population. I mean, you're not allowed to say these things, I know. And I mean, unfortunately, bloodbaths and genocidal aggression, you know, I think there would have been extreme violence, and I think people would have left and migrated and gone to the neighbouring island. And you could argue, well, that would have fixed it, and we would have been spared all of, you know, all of this. But, you know, that's a what if. And I think, you know, we're not free from violence yet. I think it could easily reappear. I think Ulster loyalists seem to have this kind of crazed, because it defies at this stage economic logic, you know. It defies their own best interest. So, you know, at what point does rational political thought begin to exit the room? And loyalists are armed, and I'm quite sure that the IRA is lurking there somewhere in the background, you know. So it's a very delicate ecology. So do these conflicts ever really end? You know, sectarian conflict in the German Sudetenland, okay, or conflict. Well, it ended when, you know, Sudeten Germans were either massacred or shoved out en masse. You don't have any Sudeten Germans anymore. You know, the descendants are living in German. Is that such extreme solutions the only way of dealing with these issues? Again, a question.
Yeah, so I was curious about the migrants in Northern Ireland and their role, and their position in the sectarian landscape. So does either of sides, both Protestant and Catholic, try to incorporate them and increase their number by incorporating this migrants according to their sectarian affiliation, like, for example, Catholics from Poland or Latino America, or Protestants from African countries, and so.
Can you hear me? Yeah, there's a substantial Polish Catholic migration to Ireland generally. I mean, there's about 150,000 Poles in the south of Ireland. They tend to have their own, from what I can see, they're either escaping Catholicism, they don't really want to have to engage with again, okay? Because as you know, in Poland at the moment, there's a very right-wing Catholic regime. The Poles I know, many of the Poles I know would suggest that the south of Ireland is a much more agreeable space, particularly people from minority backgrounds, LGB, gay and lesbian and so on. In the I don't know, in the north of Ireland, you are right, there's a substantial Polish Catholic. From what I can see, I think they rise above these differences. There's a Filipino Catholic community. Thank you. You know, do migrants want actively to take on a local conflict? Somehow I doubt it. Yeah. I know that's not very satisfactory, but I've seen no evidence of Polish Catholics becoming incorporated within local tribal divisions.